The first time I saw my son flinch when I reached to hug him, my heart shattered. It was a small movement, barely there, but it told me something was terribly wrong. I pulled him closer, felt the tension in his shoulders, and whispered, "What happened?" He shook his head, forced a smile, and said, "Nothing, Mom. I'm fine." But I knew. Mothers always know. Later that night, after he thought I was asleep, I heard him crying softly in his room. I stood outside his door, frozen, listening to the muffled sobs that carried the weight of secrets he was too scared to tell me. That was when I decided I would not let the silence continue. The next morning, I pressed him gently, and finally, the truth slipped out in fragments. Kids at school. Names thrown like knives. Shoves in the hallway. Laughter when he tripped, when his books scattered across the floor. Teachers who looked away. Friends who stayed silent. Day after day, piece by piece, they were breaking him. Imagine being 12 years old, waking up every morning already dreading the day, already rehearsing excuses to avoid the torment waiting in the cafeteria or the locker room. That was my son's reality. The bruises were not always visible. Sometimes it was a cut lip, sometimes a scuffed knee, but most of the time, it was the way his eyes dulled, the way his voice grew smaller, the way he started believing he deserved it. And that was the part that ripped me apart. Watching him accept cruelty as normal. I went to the school. I sat in front of the principal, explained what was happening, begged for action. He nodded politely, took notes, promised interventions. But nothing changed. The bullying got worse. The same boys laughed in the hallways, smirked when they saw me at pickup, their arrogance bold because they knew no one was stopping them. My rage simmered quietly. I tried to be calm, tried to trust the system, but every night, I watched my son cry himself to sleep. Every morning, I watched him drag his feet to school, his shoulders bent under a weight no child should carry. And then, one afternoon, I found his journal. He had left it half open on his desk, words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Maybe it would be better if I just disappeared. Then they would stop. My hands trembled as I read those words. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I had begged. I had pleaded. I had trusted teachers, administrators, the so-called adults in charge. And they had failed him. If no one was going to protect my child, then I would. But I was not going to scream, or fight, or stoop to their level. No, I was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. A lesson delivered so precisely, so thoroughly, that the bullies, their parents, and the entire school would finally understand the cost of cruelty. And I already knew exactly how I was going to do it. Once my decision was made, I knew I could not act out of pure anger. Revenge without strategy would only hurt my son more. If I wanted this lesson to leave a mark, I needed proof. Undeniable, inescapable proof. So I started watching more closely. I adjusted my work hours so I could be near the school. I sat in my car, parked down the street, pretending to scroll through my phone while my eyes stayed fixed on the building. And what I saw confirmed everything my son had whispered. The same boys shoved him into lockers when they thought no one was looking. They tripped him in the hallways, sending his books scattering, laughing while he scrambled to pick them up. They threw food at him in the cafeteria. And worse than the bullies were the teachers who saw and chose silence. Some glanced over and quickly looked away. Others laughed uncomfortably, pretending it was just kids being kids. I recorded everything. Photos, videos, notes with dates and times. I spoke quietly to other parents whose children had suffered in smaller ways, collecting stories of how complaints had been brushed aside. Piece by piece, I built a mountain of evidence so heavy it could crush the entire administration. But I did not stop there. I went through the school's handbook, state education laws, anti-bullying policies. I highlighted every rule they had ignored, every protection they had failed to enforce. And with every page I turned, my plan became sharper. Once I had enough, I scheduled another meeting with the principal. I walked into his office calm, my folder tucked under my arm. He gave me the same tired smile, the same hollow assurances. "We are aware of the situation. We are working on it." That was when I opened the folder and began sliding the evidence across his desk. Video clips, photos, copies of policies with bright yellow highlights, testimonials from other parents. His smile faltered. His face paled. He stammered something about context, but I cut him off. "This," I said, tapping the folder, "is negligence. If you continue to ignore it, I will make sure every parent, every teacher, and every news outlet in this city sees what is happening inside your school. The silence that followed was the sound of his power collapsing. Within days, things began to shift. The bullies were suddenly pulled from class. Their parents called in for urgent meetings. Teachers who had ignored the behavior were now frantically correcting themselves, stepping in at the slightest hint of trouble. The cafeteria where laughter once echoed turned uncomfortably quiet when my son walked in. Eyes followed him, not with cruelty this time, but with caution. But it was not enough. Not yet. Because these boys, these so-called tormentors, still thought they had won. They still thought they were untouchable. And the only way to truly end it was to show them, and their parents, the full weight of what they had done. I had forced the school to take notice. Now it was time to make the entire community watch. The school scheduled a special parent meeting a week later. They framed it as a routine discussion about student well-being, but I knew the truth. It was damage control. They wanted to soften the blow before the evidence reached too far beyond their walls. The gymnasium was packed that evening. Parents sat in stiff rows of folding chairs, whispering nervously. Teachers hovered near the walls, their faces tight with worry. And at the front, the principal stood, clutching his notes, his usual smug confidence gone. When he began speaking, his words were vague. Issues of conduct, steps being taken, our commitment to student safety. It was a performance, carefully designed to avoid real accountability. I let him finish. I let him fumble through his empty speech. And then I stood. My voice was calm, but it carried. I think the other parents deserve to see the truth. The room turned toward me as I walked forward, holding my folder. I laid out the photos, the videos, the copies of policies. One by one, the evidence filled the projector screen. Clips of my son being shoved into lockers. Images of him on the floor, picking up books while others laughed. A teacher glancing over, then turning away. And finally, a page from the school's handbook, the rule that stated bullying would not be tolerated, highlighted in bright yellow. The room erupted. Parents gasped. Some shouted. Others turned on the teachers, demanding answers. And then came the moment I had prepared for. The bullies' names were revealed. Their parents sat frozen, their faces burning red as their children's cruelty played out for everyone to see. One father jumped up, furious, accusing me of exaggeration. But the video silenced him. There was his son, shoving mine into the wall, laughing as he walked away. The truth was undeniable. The humiliation hit them harder than any punishment the school could issue. The parents who once bragged about their kids now sat in shame, their reputations shredded in front of their community. Their children, once bold and cruel, now shrank in their seats, pale and shaken as every eye in the room burned into them. And then, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in months, my son lifted his head. He was sitting in the back row, clutching my hand tightly. When he saw the room turn on his bullies, when he realized the weight had shifted off his shoulders, I saw the smallest, shyest smile tug at his lips. It was faint, but it was real. That smile fueled me more than anything else. Because this was never about vengeance for its own sake. It was about giving my child back the dignity they had stolen from him. But I was not done yet. The school had been exposed, the bullies humiliated, but I wanted this lesson to last. I wanted to make sure no one ever thought of tormenting my son, or anyone else, again. The final step would seal it forever. The fallout came fast and merciless. The very next week, the school board sent letters to every parent, acknowledging what had been exposed and outlining the disciplinary actions. The bullies were suspended, their extracurricular privileges revoked, their spotless records stained with official reports. For students who had always been handed everything, sports captaincies, popularity, teachers' excuses, it was a blow they could not hide from. But the true sting came from outside the school. Words spread through the neighborhood, whispered at grocery stores, discussed in church pews, murmured at community gatherings. Their parents could not escape it. The same families they once looked down on now looked at them with disgust. Invitations stopped coming. Friendships grew cold. Doors that were once wide open slammed shut. It was not just punishment, it was isolation. The kind they had forced onto my son now turned back on them. And while they struggled under the weight of their own shame, my son began to rise. Slowly at first, then stronger each day. He walked a little taller in the halls, no longer shrinking into the background. Teachers, now terrified of being accused of negligence again, watched him closely, defending him at the first sign of trouble. Some even apologized directly to him, words that seemed to lift a burden he had carried for far too long. At home, I watched the change with quiet pride. He laughed again. He started drawing, filling his notebooks with color instead of sadness. He spoke about dreams, about things he wanted to do, about places he wanted to go. And one night, as we sat at the table, he looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Thank you for believing me." That was the moment I knew I had done the right thing. Not because the bullies had been punished, but because my son had been given back the belief that his voice mattered. But what mattered most was the lesson the bullies would never forget. For them, it was no longer a private game of shoves and whispers. Their cruelty had been laid bare for everyone to see, and they would carry that reputation with them for years. Whenever they thought about mocking someone weaker, they would remember the night their own community turned on them. And Sarah, the principal, and every teacher who had ignored the signs, they learned too. The days of silence, of brushing it aside as kids being kids, were over. They had been exposed in the harshest light, and that stain would never fully wash away. Justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is about reflection, about making sure the pain you caused is a mirror you are forced to face again and again. They bullied my child, thinking there would never be consequences. And now, every time they stepped outside their homes, every time they faced a neighbor, every time they remembered that meeting in the gym, they lived with the lesson I had carved into their lives. Cruelty carries a cost, and that cost is unforgettable. So I will ask you, if it were your child, would you stay silent, or would you fight until the bullies and every adult who failed them understood that no one touches your child without consequences?